So I'm closing up on my, platinum run on Saros. And after playing through the game, just finished the true ending just before, I have a lot of thoughts. Especially because I've been seeing a lot of nonsense spreading on Facebook and other places, especially about the game's story. But I think this game is worth having a talk about in general, because I think, on one hand, I have really enjoyed Saros. Obviously, I almost got the platinum in it. It's just extremely fun. But I do think that in sanding off a few of the harder edges from the previous game, Returnal, I think they've kind of lost a little bit, just a little bit of what made Returnal special. So, to start with, I think before I get into any major story plot and so on, because I am going to be talking about Returnal a lot, I'm then going to be talking about Saros' story. So, if you want a pure breakdown, the sort of difference in gameplay, it's that Saros was designed to be a lot more forgiving than Returnal. Returnal was a game that, as soon as you picked it up, the game just decided to more or less punch you in the nuts over and over as much as possible. Returnal was not very forgiving, but at the same time, once you started mastering its systems and getting used to how the game worked, Returnal was also extremely rewarding to play, and I think that was really what kept it going. If you could get through the hump of the initial difficulty, Returnal was extremely rewarding and had a tremendous amount of depth to its combat and just the way it worked and its mechanics. So Returnal, in that way, I think, really rewarded you mastering systems, while Saros has... So Saros is not going to be an easy game if you weren't a sicko of Returnal. If you were really into Returnal, going into this game will feel very easy. Saros actually gives you like this really cool shield that you can use to absorb projectiles, which is a break from Returnal. And eventually you also gain the ability to parry certain types of projectiles back at the attacker. These make combat a little bit more fluid and give you some more options, which, I actually do like. For the record, before going any further, I actually do prefer the gameplay of Saros to Returnal. But only just, and in some ways, enough. But with Returnal sort of being so initially difficult, Saros is also punishing initially, but you gain this currency, which you see just next to my mini-map there, that builds up over time. And then every time you die, you then go back to like a hub area, and then the hub area lets you essentially upgrade your character permanently. So you can get more hit points, you can get more like power, you can get all sorts of different upgrades, which vastly make the game easier. And eventually, unlike in Returnal, the first biomes or so become extremely easy. Partly because, you'll start at a level that's considerably higher than it expects to be. Like, I think I had like a proficiency level, which is basically the level of your guns for all intents and purposes. And normally in Returnal, except for like a twist later on in the game, you usually start from 1, you have barely any integrity, and a wet noodle will kill you if you're not careful, and you have to build up into being strong. Whereas in Saros, inevitably you sort of end up a god. And if you go through earlier biomes, like if you don't just start at any biome you want, which is also another difference between Saros and Returnal, because Returnal you did have to play through all of the biomes from the start of the game to get back where you were. that means Saros is, you know, you start from level 1 in Saros like this, and you go through to the end boss, and you will absolutely clean the end boss's clock, because you will have so much proficiency. There's also like a there's also stats you see there, resilience, command, and drive, that also boost all of your weapons in some way. And essentially, the game becomes a lot easier than Returnal. Again, initially, Saros is not actually going to be that easy, and I've seen already a few people who have evidently been quite enamored with people going, this is an incredibly easy platinum, and then they buy it, and then they discover that the game actually kicks... We'll talk about what happened there later. The game actually kicks the shit out of you a little bit. So, with that in mind, I think overall, I really like the gameplay of Saros quite a bit, as I said, and obviously I'm a huge fan of this game because I'm spending time gibbering about it on the internet, which is, I don't really bother doing that for things I don't like. But where I think Returnal has a far better sort of interaction than Saros is actually the world and the level design. So the world is really beautiful in Saros, and it's quite compelling, and it's got all this Lovecraftian nonsense that I just absolutely love. Just break it up and inject it into my veins, But where it kind of loses out to Returnal is in the way that the levels are actually sort of flow. So Returnal was infamous for a trophy that required you to find all of these glyphs. And these story glyphs were extremely hard to find because the world was very heavily randomized. And there were a lot of different rooms and other things. When you went to a biome in Returnal, you really had to think about what you were doing because the paths and similar could be quite divergent per playthrough. Saros, I think, in making it more approachable for new players, and I'm trying not to put this in a way that's insulting to people, that's using, like saying that's a bad thing to make a game more approachable for new players. But I think it loses a little bit of the edge that Returnal had, where, the game is very predictable, right? When I go through this biome, this is the first biome in the game, so I'm deliberately trying to avoid any major spoilers here, or anything else, if you did want to avoid, anything like that. So, I think this biome has a few rooms that will be different, but as a general rule, the overall flow through this biome is going to feel very similar. And if you've done this biome a few times like I have, unlike Returnal, it doesn't really ever feel like it's showing you anything new or exciting. You're not going to find a rare... You'll find the odd rare room. I'll correct myself. But they're going to be... it's not going to be often that you're going to have this feeling of, oh my god, I've never seen this room before. Because, generally speaking, you'll see the same core set of rooms nearly every single time. And those rooms will generally always turn up. If they have a collectible in them, and there's quite a few collectibles, which we'll get into, they will generally always be there. And so if you run a biome a few times, with a few exceptions, you usually get 90% of the collectibles and story stuff easily. Now, I do understand. One of the big criticisms of Returnal, and I'm not going to be a hypocrite here because I was also mad about this, was they had a trophy for finding all of the different biomes, essentially, biomes, lore, fragments. And because these were gated behind stuff that was entirely random, you could have a very bad time getting the platinum of the game because you had no idea whether or not, those are going to turn up. And eventually, for me, I actually didn't get the platinum in Returnal because I gave up on it. So, this lack of real diversity in the biomes kind of makes replaying the same ones not as fun as Returnal. Returnal did make you play through everything from the beginning of the game. I want to emphasize one of the core differences again is that Returnal, Saros does not make you. If you want to just play through from any biome in the game, as soon as you get through one, it unlocks the next one, and you can start from any biome. And in fact, the game seems to be heavily designed around the idea that you can go to a biome, start it, play through it, and you get about a 20-minute run. And with the permanent upgrades, that's very viable. You can start in later biomes, and once you've unlocked basically the whole tree, it's actually very easy to just start there, play what you want, and not have to go back to previous biomes at all. Unless you're a story and lore sicko and you really want to collect, the collectibles. So, one of the other big gameplay differences between Saros and Returnal is Saros has these little plinths here that will start in Eclipse. So, Eclipse doors like this can't be gone through until I go and actually interact with this thing. And what this will do is it will start in Eclipse. So it has a few effects. The first is that enemies become generally more dangerous. It changes the way some biomes actually function. So not just visually like this, but also in terms of gameplay. So one biome will pick out these particularly large mechanical things that then just start sort of moving about. Another one will actually have an entire war going on in the background, which is kind of cool. A swamp will become, the water will become dangerous to you, so it's not beforehand, it's just sort of there, and then when you activate the Eclipse, it actually makes the water dangerous. And I do say that in the biomes where they really went out of their way to be a little creative with that as a mechanic, I think those make the RNG stuff a little less stinging for me, because the biome with the water especially, you really have to think about a lot of different rooms in a new way when the entire floor is going to kill you if you are not paying attention. But other than that, they did preserve the core of Returnal's gameplay, and I do think things like this Eclipse mechanic and such really do meaningfully add a lot of fun to it. Some levels I appreciate actually give you quite a lot of choice about the Eclipse. There's some where you can just straight up start the Eclipse at the beginning, but there will be missions where you end up with the Eclipse, essentially within the first, 30 seconds, and you have to take the Eclipse and fight that level in the Eclipse. But where they do interesting things with that mechanic is pretty cool, but eventually it does become a little bit limited, especially, once again, with the levels where you end up having to be forced into Eclipse straight away, and there's not really any variation between it. But the couple of levels that do use that mechanic well really sell it. This is a challenge room, I'm not going to bother doing it, mostly because I've already done all of them, and I'm trying to go for some other trophies, including one that uses modifiers. So that's the other big gameplay difference between Returnal and Saros, for those who really need to know. Saros has this system where you can add modifiers. I do think they're very inspired by Hades modifiers. Well, there's a Eclipse mechanic, by the way. Those yellow orbs give me some corruption, and that corruption reduces my max health until you clear a certain amount of rooms, and then your accumulated corruption will go away. And in fact, I need a trophy here that's about accumulating corruption, so I'm just going to do this for a bit. And as you can see, it reduces my max health a little bit, and but it will go away if I survive. But returning to the modifiers discussions, which is probably the biggest talking point about this game's difficulty, is you get the ability to basically customize the difficulty a la Hades. So you get modifiers that make the game harder, and then you get modifiers that make the game much easier. I've got a whole bunch of these modifiers on because I'm going for a trophy that requires me to have them. I think I'm at the max. Yes, I'm at the max now. Because I'm going for a trophy that requires to have them on. They're an optional system. They unlock as soon as you beat the second biome boss, but it's entirely up to you if you want to use them. You can make the game substantially harder with them as well, so they're not just to make it easier. So it becomes like a choice thing. Do you want to have an easier time or a more difficult? And it's kind of become a big focus of the discussion around this game, especially in terms of difficulty. As I said, a lot of people who really enjoyed Returnal came to this game kind of expecting, it's not called Returnal 2, but let's face it, this is basically as close to being a sequel you can be without actually having the number 2 next to it. So I have to concentrate a little bit here, this guy does with some respect. So, with that in mind, I think where I have the biggest problem with this game is not actually its gameplay. I thought the gameplay was quite satisfying, fun. Yes, it's a lot easier than Returnal, and I'm a little disappointed by that, because Returnal, once you got good at that game, it felt hugely rewarding. Whereas, there's only one really challenging biome in this game, and that's a story-related one, which we'll get into. So, at this point, if you're no longer interested in, the general difference between the story between Returnal and Saros, now is the time to get out of the video, because I'm now going to really go into the nuts and bolts of both game story. So, hopefully with that warning, if you're still listening, you're keen on that. So, what is the core difference? So, to begin with, I think it's worthwhile discussing what the actual story of Returnal is. So, Returnal, in the same sort of science fiction setup as this game, you are an astronaut called Celine. You have crash-landed on a hostile alien planet. That planet is apparently preventing you from dying. So every time Celine dies, she ends up getting reincarnated and has to do it all over again. And the mystery of Returnal is, why can't she die? What's this planet about? And that sort of thing. So, without wanting to go into an extremely detailed discussion of Returnal, the basic idea of Returnal is that Celine is going through something that it's debatable if it's real or not. But Celine is basically reliving the guilt she has from leaving her son to die in a car crash. And this is played out over numerous times where she meets various aliens and goes through these flashback sequences in an area of the planet that eerily resembles her house, and she has to basically come to terms with what she did. So, Returnal's story is kind of like an interesting puzzle. At absolutely no point does the developers Housemarque really take any time to explain the story of Returnal. It's a puzzle that you've kind of put together over time. A lot of the bosses and some of the locations and people are named after figures from Greek tragedies, and after some time you can piece it together as basically the crude summary of Returnal's story is she's basically going through hell, and hell is trying to force her to acknowledge what happened with the car crash, because she's essentially in denial. and it has some really wild twists. Like, as I said, I don't want to end up spending all day talking about Returnal in this video, because I want to talk about Saros. But it's important to understand that Saros, the kind of characters Housemarque are making for these games, they're quite complicated, right? Celine is not... You can't really inherently say Celine is a definitively good person. She did abandon her son. She has a tremendous amount of guilt. It's debatable whether or not the cause of the accident was actually her fault, or was there someone in the road, you know. There's a lot to it, and I highly recommend, if you're intrigued by that and you've never played Returnal, or you did play Returnal and you just bounced off the difficulty or whatever, that, you know, there are some excellent summaries online as to how the story of Returnal has been analyzed and that sort of thing. So I really recommend that you just do that, rather than have me try to clumsily explain a game I played years ago and only vaguely remember the story of, because there's some really, really solid analysis of the story of Returnal. But the core thing I want to really get out of that by mentioning it is that Celine is... It's hard to put Celine into the is she a definitively good person basket, because there's a lot of interpretation as to the story of Returnal. One of the trophies I needed. But if we were to say, if we were to talk about Saros' story, well, what actually happens? So obviously, I'll just quickly show my modifiers here. I've maxed out damage and a whole bunch of other stuff so that I can just clean through this last trophy. This is a progression tree at the end. As you can see, it's actually quite big. I'm certain if someone went and did some sort of analysis on these patterns, maybe there's some significance to them, but I don't know off the top of my head. I'm just here to shoot things at the moment. But what is the story of Saros? So I'm partly making this video because I saw some really, what I could just describe as absolutely dreadful summaries of it, which are being spread upon Facebook and some other social media for the point of, you know, making certain people mad about the story. So essentially, Saros has a very similar kind of setup to Returnal. You are essentially... let's go ahead and teleport you into the next one. We'll start from there. You are essentially on this mysterious alien planet called Carcosa, which, for those of you who are fans of Lovecraftian fiction, or just, I think it's Robert King's King in Yellow? No, I might have got that wrong. But fans of the King in Yellow will know that this is basically kind of like super hell. The main character, Arjun, here, relives through in a similar way to Returnal. Every time he dies, he mysteriously comes back. However, when the other people die, they tend to stay dead. And he doesn't quite understand why it is that he keeps coming back from the dead. And there's a little bit of... The story plays around a little bit with the idea that, you know, other people don't know, and he tries to keep it a secret. So, Arjun is here on Carcosa because he's part of a later expedition called Echelon 4, which was sent by this essentially evil mining corporation called Soltari, that were attempting to mine this lumisite material that they want to use to conquer the world and the universe and that sort of thing. We are here as a follow-up team to investigate why the previous 3 echelons, which were basically colonists who were here to, you know, build facilities and provide a constant supply of this material, have basically stopped responding to anyone's calls, you know. But we have a second agenda being Arjun, because Arjun isn't really here because he cares about the company or anything else. Arjun is here looking for his wife. My wife! You know, the classic video game story of angry man searches for wife is basically the classic here. But over time, Arjun comes to learn that something absolutely terrible has happened to all of the previous colonists. They're essentially have been enslaved by the planet and their bodies warped into all sorts of horrible monsters and creatures. And then it turns out that the later echelons had a civil war for control of the planet with some of the later ones. So, like Returnal, there's a lot more going on than the simple summary. Arjun has a little bit of a complicated past, and it's not as actually simple as him going to find his wife and then they get reunited, and everyone is going to live happily, and then everyone is going to live happily ever after. As you play through the game, you, like Returnal's house, you start getting these flashback segments that explain a little bit about who Arjun is as a character, but most importantly, seem to indicate that things are not all well between him and his wife, because Arjun's flashbacks show, and this is really getting into the nitty-gritty of the spoilers here for this, essentially, Arjun was actually kind of an abusive asshole. He had an affair on Nitya, and he got caught having an affair by his best friend. And one thing led to another. His best friend seems to have a desire to tell Arjun's wife Nitya that he was going to, reveal the affair. And it is heavily implied in the game that Sebastian, Arjun's friend, took a one-way trip out of a window. So, a lot of this game, kind of like Returnal, does feel a little bit like Arjun coming to terms with not only what he did to Sebastian, but also his kind of abusive negligence towards his wife. And I think that's where quite a few of, if you've seen some of the outrage about the story or kind of got it, that's where some of that's coming from. So some people are mad that, game seems to be man bad or whatever, but it's a little more complicated than that, because Arjun does spend a lot of time, he's trying to reunite with Nitya, and the initial part of the plot is sort of his obsession with getting her back at all costs, even though he has definitively lost her. So there's a little bit made about the fact that Nitya has moved on from Arjun, and you'll see these memes and similar of Arjun fights his way through a horde of aliens, wife has left him for a lesbian, lol, cucked, or whatever stupid shit that people are wanting to come out at the time. But it's a little bit more complicated than that, because, and we'll get into the is the stuff that's happening in this game real discussion later. But if we take it on its face value, Nitya's actually been here, like most of the colonists, for several hundred years. In fact, it could actually be quite a bit longer, depending on how you interpret the game's use of time. But essentially, there's some mad time dilation going on here, where a lot of the stuff that happened, like building all this civilization and such, all of this was built by the original colonists who were enslaved by the planet and went a bit crazy over it. There's a big debate as to how long it's been. So for Arjun, his ex-wife... Hold on.
The minds come alive when the eclipse burns in the sky. Even the machines hear its song. I take solace from it. It proves that I am on the path.
Yeah, so essentially, for Arjun, events with his ex-wife, for him, haven't been that long ago. Maybe a few months or something similar. But for Nitya, she has been on this planet without him for centuries. And so when he is coming back, it is not a case of, oh, that's my husband, he's coming to save me from this awful situation. She has well and truly moved on, and it's more the case that, my God, my ex-husband has somehow come back here after centuries. I barely, and she hasn't ever really forgiven him for what he's done, but she's moved on. And a lot of the conversations, and you do run into every now and again, they're what I would describe as terse. They're certainly not friendly. But at the same time, she doesn't rampantly hate his guts or anything like this. She is just more or less confused why he's here and bothering in the first place. But that's from her point of view, is because it's been centuries. So, addressing the lesbian in the room, part of it as well is that she also moved on to another relationship, and that relationship doesn't actually end well, which is usually the part that's kind of missing. So essentially, a lot of the people who came here initially from Echelon 1 and Echelon 2 ended up in this sort of power struggle for control of the planet and the power of Carcosa. And it didn't end well because one of these guys, I forget his name offhand, but one of the leaders of Echelon 1 essentially did a huge power grab, and he got rid of a lot of the other leaders who were basically supposed to share power and turn this place into a perfect utopia. And it didn't work out. So he basically murdered a bunch of them, took over, and he became like the king, which is one of the later bosses. And Nitya and a bunch of other people didn't like that, and they rebelled, and hence they had their big ass war. And that big ass war resulted in now this is a bit of my own interpretation because I'm not 100% sure, but I think the Nitya faction got their ass kicked, and the King in Yellow ended up with control over the place. And he punished Nitya, who is one of his first priestesses, for her subordination and for leading the rebellion against him by taking her girlfriend or partner, Kira, and we want to remember that name is Kira, and basically turning her into some sort of fucked up tree, which is kind of metal, actually. And Nitya didn't really like that, and so there's a part of me which wonders if some of the power play in this game is that Arjun is manipulated by his ex-wife to essentially get revenge for, and to kill the king to get revenge for what he did to Nitya's new partner, who she very deeply cared about. So, going back a little bit to why the whole find my wife thing doesn't necessarily come off so well for Arjun, is because Arjun is kind of abusive. In fact, no, he's not kind of, he is an abusive husband. Let's not sugarcoat it. He basically treats Nitya as a possession. There are things he says when you do the last biome that are just the sort of shit that you would expect from someone who is kind of an abusive asshole, actually. And he always acts very possessive, and he's just in denial about all things, like Nitya being gone, him needing to move on, and a bunch of other stuff like this. To make things worse, the flashback sequences in Saros are pretty explicit about the fact that he is also a cheater McCheating. He cheated on Nitya, and as I mentioned, Sebastian discovered this, and to keep his secret, he murdered Sebastian, which, isn't really open to any kind of interpretation. It's not like Returnal, where you have, a marked debate as to whether or not, the events are real or anything. We pretty much know that that's what happened, and that's why Nitya left. So, with this in mind, we have some other crew who I'll briefly talk about at this point, and they kind of represent different things, I think. So initially you have a fellow who, he goes a bit mad to start with, and he ends up getting put down by the commander because he's threatening everyone else and, you know, going kind of crazy with the shore and Carcosa. And he gets shot, and then as you go through different biomes and advance the story, some of the other characters start going a bit mad as well. There's this fellow called Stax, who is the pilot. He really loses it, starts painting the yellow shore everywhere, and starts ranting about it. He ends up eating a bullet. And then there's another character called Kayla. She's a African-American lady, I think. And basically, she stops trusting Arjun and just wants to figure out a way out of all this madness. So, they all kind of have different roles in the story. The captain eventually gets shot after she butchers Stax, and then is about to kill Kayla. And Arjun is sort of in the middle of this. And he kind of doesn't really care that much about what's happening with the other crew. The other crew don't really matter to him. The other colonists don't matter to him. The corporation definitely doesn't matter to him. He is just here solely and utterly so he can get his wife back after she walked out on him, more or less. And the character Kayla is worthwhile noting here, because in a lot of the really bizarre, like, pushback to this, these people, for some reason, keep claiming that the story is about, you know, Arjun getting left by his wife at the end of the game to go with Kayla or something. And it's kind of a strange lie. Like, I don't know why they're coming out with this, because Kayla does not, at any point in the game that I have experienced, and I've almost got the platform, I've nearly got all of the associated collectibles and similar, and just to point that out, like, here's all the audio logs. I'm only missing a handful of audio logs, but I've got all of the ones right at the end of the game and similar. There's absolutely no evidence for this. And Kayla and Nitya don't ever actually interact, as far as I can tell, in the story. So it's this really bizarre lie that people are kind of bringing out about the story, and it just makes them look like they have no media literacy whatsoever. Not to mention that, as I said, the story's a little bit more complicated because there was a moving on period, and we'll get back to that when we discuss is it real, or is it kind of like in Arjun's head as a punishment later. But that's essentially it. And the way the story plays out from here is that, yes, Arjun increasingly fights his way through all of these biomes. He inevitably takes on the king, and after murdering the king, he becomes the king, which is actually a really interesting ending initially. So he becomes the king, shit goes wild, and you see this really creepy cutscene where he sort of takes possession of his ex-wife, and she does not look happy about it, and it is not a good end. It is in no way implied to be a good or positive ending. Like, she just looks positively miserable. So the true ending of the game involves Arjun, kind of like the true ending of Returnal, involves Arjun going through some of the previous biomes. He inevitably finds Nietzsche's new lover, who talks to him and explains, what he has to do. And ultimately, what he ends up being told straight up, you've got to let go and move on. You did the damage you did. It can't be taken back. It can't be fixed. Nietzsche no longer loves him, which, again, he cheated on her. Then he was drinking to excess. The way he talks to her in one of the flashback cutscenes is absolutely atrocious, in fact. So I can definitely see why this woman had enough and was like, no, fuck you. And so with the true ending, it's about him realizing that he has to let go of her. He can't get her back. He did the damage that he did. And so essentially, once that happens, you then fight the king again, and then you have, unlike the previous times, once you've done it, you gain the option to just walk away from the king. You don't have to destroy him, and then as he's looking back at the shore, he starts warping and his body is changing into the king, and he goes, but I let go, and then he realizes what his mistake is, and then he inevitably realizes that what he has to do is fully let go of her. So he throws the symbol of their love that he's been wearing the whole game into the ocean. And then they have a sort of like one last final conversation together. And that's basically it. And the game kind of ends, I'll actually say a little anticlimactically, at that, where he just sort of just moves on, right? Like, he acknowledges what he's done. They have a final conversation, which is actually quite nice. But ultimately, he realizes that he can't get her back anymore, and he fully lets go. Which, in his particular case, given some of the things the game implies, like he had an extremely abusive father who the game implies doesn't even imply, straight up says hit his Argent's mother, and hence this is all a cycle of abuse style narrative as well, and fits the kind of roguelike cycles you go through here. Losing my point a little bit here, actually, just give me a moment. Yeah, so he lets go of the cycle. And part of that is at the end, and we'll get into the big discussion, is that he's sitting there at the beach just minding his own business, and then there are sounds of police sirens. So I've mentioned it a few times in the video already, but one of the key things with Returnal and Saros as puzzles is, should you take what's happening in the game literally or figuratively? And by that, it comes down very simply, is it real? And I've got a mixed opinion on this. So, on one hand, we'll return a little bit to Returnal. So, Returnal had a really interesting story, because the primary point of the Returnal story was about Celine being forced to confront the guilt of leaving her son to die. And that the entity in Returnal, Chaos, is heavily implied to be sort of like some sort of master of purgatory or whatever else. And he is trying to and through Atropos, whether or not Atropos is real or she's in an insane asylum, I've never played the DLC for Returnal, so I apologize if there's an actual answer in Returnal that I'm glossing over because I've never played the DLC. But it's very clear, there's very good evidence for people who want to argue it that the events of Returnal aren't real. And that essentially everything in Returnal is Celine being some sort of meltdown where she's trying to process the grief of what happened to her son. perhaps she's in a coma in hospital, which is one I've seen around that I think is quite likely after the accident. You know, it's quite possible to survive drowning, but not necessarily wake up for some time. And I think people who take the game more literally are not necessarily as many. Is Saros literal, or is it in his head? I think there's evidence both ways. On one hand, there's evidence that the Echelon stuff happens in the flashbacks and similar. You can live through a little bit of their lives, and it seems to be that the stuff actually that does have some basis in reality. You can get emails between Nitya and her future boss, / overlord, / guy she goes to war with. Echelon is mentioned in some of the flashbacks, and it does seem that it's a little bit more played straight. One of the main reasons I say that Saros is more likely that we're supposed to accept what's happening as being real rather than some sort of self-purgatory is the fact that there are other people in Saros, and that they're not all like important to the main character. Like a lot of the monsters and a lot of the situations and similar in Returnal, like I think just about every enemy or monster. I'll take the sword blade pin just to show it off rather than using the same weapons. So, because these people feel distinct, right? You have like Kayla, who's very skeptical and eventually becomes afraid of Arjun as the game goes on. You have the stalwart captain who fails everyone and ends up executing her own crew in cold blood. You have Stack, who's just lost his shit entirely. And there's also some other NPCs who are scattered around as well and have minor roles in the story. I think these are real people, and I don't think they're people who are important to, they don't feel like they're inherently linked to or important in some way to Arjun's life. So it's not like he's pulled in his friends and family and similar into his own hell who are teaching him life lessons. I think it's quite likely that they're real. I do see that there's an argument that this is another kind of purgatory or hellhole of a planet, especially with just how wacky all of the physics and time in Carcosa are compared to the real world. But I do think this game plays its story a lot straighter than Returnal, and I think it's a lot easier to argue that, yeah, the stuff in here we can take a bit more literally than Returnal. And that gets me to what is my problem with Saros. And really what my genuine problem with the story actually is that Returnal has a lot of nuance to it. And especially with the way we should view the accident and what happens with Celine, right? So Celine, as I've mentioned, loses her son in an accident, and Returnal's story is about her going through the task of dealing with her grief and also just acknowledging the event. Celine is a complex character, and it's really hard to say definitively, is she a bad person? Did she do the wrong thing? Was the accident her fault? Like, there's just so much nuance to Returnal's story. And where I think Saros' story is much weaker than Returnal's story is that I think it's too unequivalent that Arjun is just a bad dude. Like, yeah, he moves on at the end. Yeah, he comes to terms with what he's done. And in the interpretation that this is him working through his guilt and finally moving on from his ex-wife and realizing that you can't fix what you broke, and, you know, I can tell you right now, you can't always fix what you broke. He doesn't have the same nuance to the discussion as to is he a bad person? Are his actions justified? Because he's kind of a shitty person. He was a bad drunk. He kept telling his wife lies. Like it's heavily implied that he was going out, fucking about, and drinking and doing all sorts of things like that, while telling his wife the opposite. Arjun, once you start getting a little bit further into the game, into the last area especially, some of the stuff he says is actually really possessive and completely what you would expect from someone who was abusive. And, he was abused himself, and he grew up in an abusive household. That doesn't justify many of his actions. And straight up, he murders his friend. And this is not a thing the story leaves up to interpretation. Did he kill him or not? The game essentially explicitly shows you that he murdered his friend. And one of the ways you can kind of tell that his friend early on in the game is a hallucination, and I actually picked this almost immediately. I got this immediately when I was initially playing through it, is because none of the other crew interact with him whatsoever. Sebastian appears near the tree where you have your flashbacks. No one else ever interacts with him. And so I feel that, I don't want to say Returnal is a masterclass of storytelling, because the story is very obtuse and you really have to work at getting it. But Returnal is a masterclass of allowing the player to put together a story and give them pieces that kind of justify a narrative that they'll find satisfying, or a narrative that they think works and that they can support. Like, you can have good argument. I obviously think in Returnal that the Atropos is not necessarily a real place, and is more like a purgatory of the head. And there's good evidence for that. But, there's also evidence that perhaps we should take the events literally, and that, perhaps she does have the accident, but she goes on this journey into space because she's trying to get away from everything. And she ends up on this hellhole of a planet that's essentially able to twist her memories and fears against her. And that's a perfectly valid interpretation. Whereas I feel Saros, again, the human crew that don't have any relation to Arjun in any way, except for the one guy who is, the one guy who does have a personal relation to who Arjun is as a person, is also the guy who's not real. Whereas everyone else, you can really start to argue they might actually be quite real. So, we don't have the same kind of nuance to the story that I think Returnal does. And I think Returnal has a much deeper and more interesting story than Saros is able to do. Not just because there's more of a debate about the morality and actions of the main character Celine and how she's approaching her guilt, but because Saros is just so explicit about Arjun being a kind of shitty person. Like, you can argue Celine is a shitty person for various reasons, and there's evidence, as I said, that goes both ways as to, whether or not her guilt is because she just can't get over the fact she chose to save herself, or is her guilt because she was just overtired and she caused the accident to begin with, and she basically killed her son through negligence, Like, there's a discussion you can have. But the discussion in Saros sort of begins and ends with the fact that Arjun's a bit of an abusive asshole, and after that, you can't really go anywhere. Like, once you've portrayed a character as someone who, murdered his friend to cover up his affair, was abusive towards his partner, and there's a line where Nietzsche looks at him and basically says, you are like your father, and his father was definitely a bad person. it kind of takes away that nuance of the discussion. Like there isn't a lot you can go through and talking about the story of Saros and Arjun as a character once you get there. And so I think that's my main critique. While I love the game, and it's still one of my favorite games of this year, it's kind of like, it captures the spirit of what I loved about Returnal, but it doesn't quite capture the nuance. It doesn't really get the depth that Returnal did, from the biomes that are very similar every time you play them, to the reduced difficulty, to the and to the story, really. And where I kind of get let down with Saros in the end was the story, because I love the story of Return, and I love the interpretations and the wide variety of opinions it allows. And where Saros loses me in the end, as a conclusion, is just that the story doesn't have that nuance. It doesn't have that ability to be like, yeah, this story is deep and I can interpret it in many ways. Because while there's a lot of interpretation around the actual events, like who did what the first colonists did, the nature of the war, and the relationship of the king to Nietzsche and that sort of stuff, it loses me in the lack of interesting nuance with the main character. He's very straightforward, and I think ultimately his motivations and what happens to him, I think, is very straightforward. And by lacking that depth in the main character, it's kind of like, yeah, okay. So the guy's a bad dude, and he's living through hell, and he kind of deserves it. And that's kind of where you kind of end up with, in my opinion. I mean, there might be other interpretations. I'll be interested to see once other people have really delved into all of the lore and all of the secrets, and, you know, gone through all of the various enemy and boss biomes come up with. But I think that simplicity in the end doesn't really do any favors to Saros compared to Returnal. And so I like many of the gameplay updates and similar, and I think, yeah, making the game more accessible so that less people kind of bounce off it straight away is good. I'm really let down ultimately by the story. And as Returnal managed to blend this perfect, you know, almost perfect lightning in a bottle, you know, compelling gameplay that really matched the kind of story it was telling. And I know they've tried to capture that again. And while I love Saros, I don't want to say I think it's a bad game in any way. It kind of just falls short of what Returnal did. And it really does show that it's extremely hard to really redo the magic of a game like Returnal, which so perfectly blended its gameplay and its storytelling mechanisms, and then provided you with this fantastic puzzle to solve twice in a row. So yeah, hopefully it's been quite a while, but hopefully you get something out of that. And yeah, that's the basic plot of Returnal, and hopefully this also answers some of the bullshit misinformation that's going around.